Hello, Mr. Sacino's AP Psychology class. This is Mr. Lannis. Apparently, I am the most knowledgeable person here at Salesian with regards to the nervous system and the brain and all sorts of things. And so Mr. Sacino has asked me if I would put together a quick lecture going over, reviewing, moreover, the nervous system. Specifically, my goals here in this lecture are to talk about the organization of the nervous system, how we organize the nervous system into what we'll call the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And then after we talk about organization, we're going to talk about the brain, and we'll talk about neurons, if you can see that line there, neurons. Specifically, we'll be talking about the anatomy of the brain and the anatomy of neurons, as well as the physiology. Quickly, for those of us who aren't aware, the difference between anatomy and physiology: anatomy is all about structure. All right, so it's how it's all put together, and to be able to identify different parts of the brain, for example. Being able to identify it and call it something is the anatomy of the brain. But when we talk about physiology, we're talking about function. Okay. And so our goal by the end of this lecture is to be able to identify the different parts and the different parts of the nervous system in terms of its organization, to be able to identify parts of the brain, to be able to identify parts of a neuron, and then to also be able to tell us what those parts do, what their function is. So we'll learn about the anatomy and the physiology. So let's get started. So, at its most fundamental, the nervous system is just a system in your body where it allows your body to sense the outside world, to sense it in many ways. Obviously, you have your 5 senses, and to be able to integrate or process what you're sensing, to figure out essentially what's going on around you, and then to respond to it. Okay, so it's all about sensation, processing, and response, or motor response. So, if we're talking about the organization of the nervous system, we're going to start where it says start, number 1. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at those receptors. Receptors, it says, are sensory structures that detect changes in the internal or external environment. There will be, we can describe 3 different types of receptors. We talk about special sensory receptors. Okay, special sensory receptors are what we talk about as our 5 senses. What is it? Sight, taste, smell, hearing, and something else. Oh, balance. Okay. And vision, of course. Sight. Those are our 5 special senses. Of course, we also have our sense of touch, our ability to sense heat or temperature, our ability to sense pressure, even though we may or may not recognize that ability as a sense. It is a sense, and we call that sense the somatic sensory receptors. And then, of course, you've got your sense of self, the visceral sensory receptors that senses what's going on inside your body. Okay, all of these things are receptors. They receive information, and then they send that information to the main processor, the brain. But in order to get to the brain, it has to not only must you sense it, but you must send it to that processing center. And you do that through an organization or a part of the nervous system called the peripheral nervous system, which is basically made up of all of your nerves. In fact, we will be talking about these nerves as the sensory nerves compared to the motor nerves. So that our receptors send signals through the sensory nerves, or through the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, onto the central processing unit. That is to say, our brain. Okay, our brain is where information is processed. You figure out, essentially, your brain tells your body, oh, I've sensed something that is warm. That information has passed its way through your receptors, through the sensory nerves, into your brain. Your brain says, oh, that's hot. And it activates the motor pathway, or the response pathway that says, oh, let's move my hand away from the oven. Okay, so again, we start with our receptors. We go through our sensory division so that we can get processed. And then from that processing, we will develop a response that sends an information through the motor division, and that can activate skeletal muscle, for example, which moves your body in response to a particular stimulus. Ultimately, I'd ask that you probably should take a better look, maybe pause the video to look at our this slide again. This is a slide that's rich in information. So I've eliminated all of the writing on this slide, so you can pause to take a look. What I've just described in the previous slide can be otherwise displayed in this kind of flowchart. This is a different way of displaying the same information that I just described. It's a more hierarchical way of describing or organizing the nervous system. The nervous system in many ways can be divided into two separate parts. Oops, let me not move my slide, and let me use a pen instead. All right, the nervous system can be divided into the central nervous system, which is ultimately the brain and the spinal cord. All right, that's simple. Central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. But if we talk about the peripheral nervous system, we know that, just from our previous slide, is divided into at least two parts. The peripheral nervous system is divided into what we're going to call the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic almost looks like automatic, and that helps us understand what it means. It communicates with our internal glands, internal organs. We don't really have control over the autonomic nervous system. This part of our nervous system, this part of our peripheral nervous system, acts on its own. We don't have conscious control over this portion of our nervous system. So if we take a look at the autonomic system, we can understand the sympathetic division as well as the parasympathetic division. We call this the arousing division or the calming division. So when your body gets worked up, when you get really nervous and jittery, when you go through your fight or flight response, the sympathetic division of your autonomic division of your peripheral nervous system is being activated. And when your body starts to calm down from those nerves, from those butterflies in your stomach, then that is to say your parasympathetic division is beginning to operate. So that's the autonomic system. That's the autonomic organization or those categories, part of the peripheral nervous system. The one that's probably more interesting, I'd say, is the somatic nervous system. Again, this is part of the peripheral nervous system, but it's the part of the peripheral nervous system that we have direct control over. It communicates with our sense organs and voluntary muscles. Obviously, key word here is voluntary. We have voluntary control over our somatic nervous system. So, for example, again, we said that's split up into two parts. The sensory nervous system, where we receive information and it's sent into the central processing or the brain, and the motor division, or the motor or the efferent nervous system, which once the brain processes information, it sends a response through the motor division towards our skeletal muscles so that we can move our body in response to a stimulus. And so now that we've discussed the organization of the nervous system, let's begin talking about the brain itself. We'll talk about the anatomy of the brain. First things first, if we look at a brain, what you're going to see is this type of organ that's made up of many folds. It's a largely folded organ that has a large deal of surface area that allows for many interactions between the different cells and the different regions of the brain to communicate with one another. We're going to start from the outside-most part of the brain, the most folded part of that brain, and we're going to move towards the center of the brain. In my discussion of the brain anatomy and even the brain physiology, I'm not going to do much reading. There's going to be some text on the page. I'm going to rely on you guys to pause the video and to take a look at what the text says so that I don't just have to read to you. So we're going to start with the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain. It's the brain on it's the outermost portion of the brain as well. And it is really ultimately what makes our brain different than any other organism's brain. It is because our cerebrum is so large compared to the rest of our body, compared to the rest of our brain, it lends such complexity and the higher order thinking and the complexity of thought that probably, now I don't know enough about psychology, but it probably makes psychology exist at all, because it creates this complex kind of organ. The cerebrum itself is split up into 5 different lobes, and we're going to take a look at each of those lobes. So here we go. Those lobes are named in no particular order. We're going to see the frontal lobe. Obviously, the frontal lobe is in the front of the brain. So if you put your hand on your forehead, you're touching or you're close to the frontal lobe of your brain. The temporal lobe is easy to remember because if you place your hands on your temples, you are looking at the temporal lobe. So there's another mnemonic device there. The other 3 lobes are a little bit more difficult to remember, so we just have to remember them. The parietal lobe. All right, put your hand on the crown of your head, and you'd be touching the parietal lobe. It is what we call posterior to the frontal lobe. So that is to say, it's towards the back of your body. And then on the very back of your head, right where that notch is, if you feel your skull, for example, you'll feel a little protrusion that at the very back of your head, right before there's that little hole behind your head. You're touching, or you're close to touching, your occipital lobe. All right, and so that occipital lobe it's a weird-looking word, and it's pronounced again occipital. And then finally, the last lobe in the cerebrum is one that you can't even touch or even come close to touching, because it's closer towards the center of your brain. It's called the limbic lobe. Sometimes the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, sometimes those are called the higher brain, and the limbic lobe is called the middle brain. It's sort of in between higher order thinking and lower order thinking, or lower order feeling to some degree. We're going to talk more about these lobes in a second. So first things first, the frontal lobe. Again, it's at the front of our head, and the frontal lobe in many ways is why you're here at school. We are training your frontal lobe to do complex thought, complex thinking, critical thinking, all those things that you hear again and again and again in your AP classes, for example. The frontal lobe is required for problem solving, memory, language, motivation, judgment, impulse control, and even social and sexual behavior. Okay. Your frontal lobe, and specifically your prefrontal cortex, which is over somewhere around here. Again, this is higher order thinking. This is really what makes us as intelligent as human beings can be, because we are able to solve problems, we are able to reflect on the past and potentially meditate on the future. It all happens here in the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe, on the other hand, deals a little bit more with emotions, and also responsible for some kinds of those special senses. Senses, specifically smelling and tasting. You can imagine, because it's close to your ears, you have some kind of musical awareness and musical appreciation here in the temporal lobe. It also has, importantly, some important language areas, specifically, I believe, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Those places allow us as human beings to be able to speak language, read language, hear language, and understand those sounds, to have some sort of meaning attached to them. It sounds pretty mundane, but it's pretty extraordinary if you give it some appropriate thought. In the parietal lobe is a big area for sensation. There's a particular strip of the parietal lobe right about here that allows us to sense our surroundings, specifically the somatic sensory division of our peripheral nervous system. Eye-hand coordination, or hand-eye coordination, arm movement, a big part of the parietal lobe as well. Again, I mentioned Broca's area previously. I think I also mentioned Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is actually somewhere around there. Okay, Broca's area is over here. Again, those are important for recognizing language to have meaning. Again, a really important part of the human brain, and specifically, the academic brain. Occipital lobe is pretty simple. It's more or less mainly devoted to vision. There are, in the front of your head, you have eyes, and those eyes have nerves, specifically known as the ocular nerve, and that ocular nerve goes straight all the way to the back of the brain, and your vision or your sight is processed here. So the light passing through your eyes hits your retina, and your retina sends signals to your brain, and your brain makes sense of those signals so that you can see an image. All right, and that's what the occipital lobe is mainly used for. Again, the limbic lobe is located deep in the brain and makes up the limbic system. So we're going to break apart the limbic system briefly. All right, so the limbic system, when we talk about the limbic system, what we really need to remember is emotion and memory. Emotion and memory. And in many ways, those are often tied. There's a reason why emotions are tied to memories and memories are tied to emotions. There's a reason for that because they are processed in a similar portion of the brain, that is to say, the limbic system. And also, any kind of signal that comes through through the brainstem, if it's going to reach the higher frontal cortex, for example, or the frontal lobe, it has to pass through the limbic system first. So many emotional responses, many higher order responses, that is to say critical thinking responses, are tied to emotions because those signals pass through the lower brain and the midbrain before they actually pass through the higher brain. There's many different portions of or many different parts of the limbic system. Important ones, they're all important, of course, but hypothalamus is very important. Amygdaloid nucleus, or also known as the amygdala, okay, as well as the hippocampus. The amygdala and the hippocampus are very important for memory, short-term memory, and importantly, long-term memory storage. And if you have damage to any one of the amygdala or the hippocampus, you might have severe memory loss or severe memory distortion. I recommend the movie Memento if you've never seen it before. It's all about memory, and it's a great sort of lesson in the limbic system, for example. But let's take a look at the hypothalamus really quickly. All right, the hypothalamus part of the brain is just a very small portion. It sits underneath another portion of the brain called the thalamus. If you're at all into breaking apart words, you'll know that you see thalamus there, and you see this root word hypo. Hypo just simply means under or below. Oops, shoot. Oh, yikes, I'm ruining my iPad. All right, it means either under or below. So it literally means this portion of the brain is below the thalamus. But more importantly is what it does. It regulates what we call homeostasis. Homeostasis is your sense of stability or equilibrium, specifically with regards to your water balance, body temperature, and so on and so forth. When you have the flu, for example, and you generate a fever, what's going on is your hypothalamus is trying to, or when you're sweating, for example, your hypothalamus is trying to regulate your body temperature. So the hypothalamus itself is sending signals to your body telling you to sweat or to shiver so that you maintain a level body temperature. But more importantly, is probably for psychology, is the hypothalamus is the center for emotional response and behavior. And so if we're talking about emotional aspects of psychology, you're probably going to be talking, or at least your discussion will be rooted in the hypothalamus. Finally, the last portion, or anatomical region of the brain that we'll talk about is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is simply important for body movement, balance. It is important for coordination. If I can write, I've got some coordination, which tells me that my cerebellum is working correctly. If I can run, if I can stand on one foot, it means my cerebellum is working properly, because all of those signals that come from my balance senses in my ear, for example, they're sending them directly to the cerebellum to make sure I don't fall over. Okay, so that's the cerebellum, and that wraps up the quick overview of brain anatomy and physiology. Now we're going to start talking about the microscopic portion of the brain. So here it is, the microscopic anatomy of the nervous system, which centers on a single kind of cell. Though it is made up of several different kinds of cells, we're going to be focusing on this one cell called the neuron. You may have heard of it. It's the main cell in all of our nervous system. It's the cell that transmits information through electrochemical signals. And it's the cell that forms all of our brain, as well as all of our nerves. Essentially, any nervous tissue that exists in your body is composed of neurons. And so we're going to talk about what they look like and what they do. All right, so this, my friends, is a neuron. And it looks complicated. It's not really that complicated. There are just lots of branches and arms so that this neuron can send lots of signals and receive lots of signals. Again, let's remember that the nervous system, the whole nervous system, it's all about sensation, sense, processing, and then response. And so in order for any of this information to be transmitted, it has to be transmitted through cells, because obviously we are made of cells. And so these cells are very specialized kinds of cells that have very specialized kinds of structures. And so these structures help transmit information from our sensory system to our brain to the motor system. So what we see here, originally we see dendrites, these little branches at the very tip towards the right of our cell. These are all dendrites. These are dendrites. These are dendrites. These are dendrites. These are dendrites. Dendrites are information receivers. They receive incoming transmissions or incoming pieces of information. And their job is to tell the rest of the cell that they're receiving information. That once that information is received, it will head on to the cell body. That cell body will integrate and process those little signals, and if those little signals accumulate to a great enough magnitude, those signals will send themselves onwards towards what we call the axon, also known as the conducting fiber. The axon is sheathed, that is to say, it is wrapped in certain kinds of cells. These cells are known as Schwann cells. Schwann cells are insulating cells. That is to say, they're made of fat so that the electrical signal that's being transmitted doesn't get lost leaving the cell too early, so that that information or that signal is not transmitted to the next cell. These Schwann cells, ensure that the signal is transmitted all the way to the end of the axon. Okay, so these Schwann cells sheathe the axon, and as a result, we call those Schwann cells a myelin sheath, because these Schwann cells make this insulating molecule known as myelin. It's a protein. And so this axon is long, and it can be as long as a nerve. Some nerves are essentially just bundles of axons. And those axons end at what we call the axon terminals. Terminal meaning ending. And these axon terminals are information transmitters. So we see information receivers in the dendrites and information transmitters in the axon terminals, which makes sense because the axon terminals of one neuron will send their information to the information receivers, that is to say the dendrites of the next neuron in line. So in many ways, this is just sort of like a game of telephone, where one neuron cell or one nerve cell collects a message processes that message and then sends it along down the line. So let's take a look at see how this all works. So quickly, like I said, in your nervous system, your nervous system is made up largely of neurons, but there are also many other supporting cells. So we see a neuron here, okay, but we see a bunch of other cells, all here and here and here. We see other cells here and here. These are just supporting cells that help ensure that the neurons send their signals as effectively and as efficiently as possible. So I don't think need to know that what an oligodendrocyte is, or microglial cell, or an astrocyte is, but it is important to know that there are other cells in the nervous system. So this is a quick little diagram reminding us of how neurons work. Dendrites received and collect electrical signals. The cell body integrates those signals and generates outgoing signals that sends it to the axon. The axon then passes the electrical signals to the dendrites of the next or of another cell down the line of that nerve or of that nerve pathway. So this diagram quickly gives us a representation of one cell probably sending a signal to the next cell. And it sends that signal and it transmits that signal here at this place called a synapse. Now, you might also hear it described as a synapse. Keep in mind that when I was in my my physiology class in college, I had a British professor, and I guess the Brits pronounce this word synapse, so I always got used to calling it the synapse. And so at the synapse, we see information being transmitted, and it's really important. It's probably the most important part of the nerve cell, or at least the most important region. And so we're going to take a much closer look at this. What's going on at the synapse? So what we have to visualize here is that this is the axon of one cell, what we'll call the presynaptic cell. That is to say, the cell that comes before the synapse. And then this is the dendrite of the postsynaptic cell, the cell that comes after the synapse. And what's going on here is, we've probably heard this word before, but these molecules that are created by one neuron, known as neurotransmitters, these neurotransmitters are transmitted across the synapse. So first of all, what is a synapse? A synapse is just all it is a space. Right? It's the now two nerve cells or two neurons aren't actually touching, but what they are doing is they are coming very, very close to touching, and once at the very, very closest point at the synapse, one cell releases molecules known as neurotransmitters to the next cell. And if the next cell receives enough neurotransmitters, it can generate a new signal. It can receive that information and propagate a new signal transduction pathway down its axon to the next neuron. So what we're seeing here is neurotransmitters stored in vesicles, those vesicles being secreted, or rather those neurotransmitters being released or secreted into the synapse, those neurotransmitters being attached to a receptor molecule on the next neuron. And if we're going to find that when neurotransmitters are attached in a great enough magnitude, a new signal is propagated. So we're going to get down into the really nitty-gritty part of the physiology of neurons. Okay, I'm not sure if you need to know this, but we're going to talk about it quickly anyway. What's important to know is that, first of all, these are all cells, and so all cells have cell membranes. So that's our plasma membrane or our cell membrane. And on the outside portion of our cell, there are things called electrolytes. All right, sometimes you've heard of these talked about in your energy or your sports drinks. Electrolytes. All electrolytes are sodium ions, chlorine ions, and potassium ions. And so with enough electrolytes, you can generate what's known as a potential, or that is to say, a difference in charge. On the outside of your cell, you've got lots of sodium ions, specifically sodium ions, and sodium ions are positively charged. So that makes the outside of your cell having a very positive charge. And the inside of your cell has less positive charge. It's got lots of very negative molecules like phosphates, other negative molecules like chloride ions. It's got some positives, but the positives are counterweight or counterbalanced by all of these negative charges. So the inside of your cells are very negatively charged. So we have a very positively charged outside, a very negatively charged inside. That is to say, we have a difference in charge from the outside to the inside of the cell, which is another way of saying we have a potential. It's this potential that allows cells to transmit information. And it's this potential is caused by different concentrations of electrolytes or different concentrations of ions inside and outside of the cell. Well, what does that have to do with anything with neurons and the nervous system? Well, remember that what happens is we've got these neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are being released from the axon terminals of the presynaptic neuron, and they're being released towards these receptor molecules. Where are they here? These ion channels. We're going to call them receptor molecules. These receptor molecules grab hold of these neurotransmitters, and let's take a look over here now. So let's imagine that this neurotransmitter has been released from the presynaptic axon terminal, and it's received, or it connects to the receptor portion of this ion channel. And what happens now, once this neurotransmitter falls into place, it acts like a key, and it opens a door. It opens this ion channel so that all of these sodium ions can pass right into the cell. And what goes on now, when all of the sodium ions, these positive ions, go into the cell, is that the cell now becomes more and more and more positive. All right? So that's what's going on here. And essentially, anytime you have any kind of nervous situation, any kind of nervous signal, this is what's going on. Neurotransmitters are being released from one neuron to the next, and those neurotransmitters are being received by a receptor molecule, which opens a door and lets sodium ions in. All right. And so what happens then is an action potential can potentially be generated. An action potential is ultimately what happens when enough sodium ions come into the cell that turns your membrane potential from a very negative 70 to a very positive 30. Okay, and so when your membrane potential changes from negative 70 to positive 30, an action potential is generated in your cell body, and that axon or information is sent right through that axon to the next axon terminal, and that generates or that propagates more neurotransmitter to be sent to another neuron. Okay, so action potentials are generated when what we call the neuron to be depolarized. So when enough neurotransmitter hits our dendrites, we have an action potential that sends information all the way through our axon so that more neurotransmitter can be released into the next neuron to continue that transmission of signal. So I think I pretty much covered as much as I know about the nervous system. I've covered the organization of the nervous system. I've covered the anatomy of the brain and the physiology of the anatomy of the brain. And I've also covered the anatomy of neurons as well as the physiology of neurons. So I hope I did a good job. I hope you learned a little bit. If you have questions, you're more than welcome to contact me, come see me in my classroom, or email me. I'm free to answer any questions about the nervous system, and I'll be of as much help as I can. All right, thanks guys. Goodbye.